at 3.6%, and that's a significant uptick from 2016, which was only at 3.1%, which is all good news. But we need to make sure that this momentum is sustained and that we continue to have that growth and more, and importantly, that growth is shared more equitably. Now, looking at the downside, as we always do, there are risks to the downsides, including political uncertainty. And we all remember the green shoots of 2011, which did not last very long. So what will we do during those spring meetings? Well, with the 189 representatives of the membership, finance ministers, governors of central banks, we will be discussing how we can sustain that momentum, how, irrespective of political cycles, we can make sure that our global economy is more resilient, how it is rooted in stronger growth, more inclusive growth, and with good cooperation amongst all. So how do we actually focus on more growth and more inclusive growth? You will have seen the global policy agenda, which is, I think, on each of your chairs. And it's in that document, which is submitted to the board of the IMF, that I share with you the objectives that we will pursue. Our first priority is to maintain the growth momentum. Using which tools? Well, the traditional fiscal, monetary, structural reform tools that we put together as that three-pronged approach, which has to be tailored to each country's specificity. Second, and really importantly, we need to reinvigorate productivity, especially by boosting innovation and trade, which both fuel productivity, as is very clearly demonstrated by a recent research paper that we published. And we need to make that global growth more inclusive. That inclusiveness needs to be identified and supported by policies on three dimensions: within countries, across countries, and between generations. So what do we mean by more equitable growth within countries? We mean making tax and benefit systems more equitable, boosting high-quality infrastructure investment, and mitigating the impact of the structural changes that are taking place. And these policies can take different forms depending on the country's specificities. It can be minimum wages or raising them when they're way too low. It means expanding in-work tax credit, the earned income tax credit, for instance. It means stepping up retraining, job search, labour market-specific policies, relocation supports, revisiting housing policies in order to facilitate labour mobility. Now, I also mentioned the intergenerational, in other words, over time, how do we make sure that that growth is equitable? Well, what it means is protect future generations against imprudent actions of today's generation. And here we're referring to the excessive debt burden, we're referring to unsustainable pension schemes, we're referring to poor or not maintained infrastructure, and the impact of climate change. Finally, stronger cooperation across countries would help reduce excessive external imbalances, clamp down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. And it also means focusing on delivering on the sustainable development goals so that the low-income countries can also reap the benefit of these improved productivity and these good policies that we are recommending. All countries, of course, should guard against what I have called the self-inflicted wounds, such as restrictions, subsidies, and other trade distortions that reduce competition and economic openness. Now, on the question of trade, which is clearly on the mind of some, we are very pleased to see that trade is picking up. Is trade going to continue to increase and grow? We do think so. Is trade operating in a perfect environment with the perfect setting? No. Is there room to improve that? Of course. Should it be done in a cooperative forum, such as on the occasion on a week like this, with all finance ministers around and talking to each other in a cooperative setting and forum such as the IMF? Yes, we think so. With that, I'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Let's begin down here in the front row. Yes, sir. No. You, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Director Lagarde. I'm Wang Guan with CCTV and CGTN from China.
Morning.
Morning to you. My question is, you once described the post-recession world economy as the new mediocre. Do you think we're seeing an end to it? And in particular, what role, if any, have the China's recent economic performance and economic policies been playing in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you. When I referred to the new mediocre, there was a combination of two mediocres. The first one was growth, which was, at around 3.1%. And the second one was the growth potential, which was also alarmingly mediocre. The first one is certainly a lot better. And as I said, growth is picking up and there is a momentum underway which we need to sustain with the right short-term policies. But the growth potential still needs a lot of work. And there is clearly a need for policies that will support and encourage and improve productivity. This is one area where clearly policymakers have to focus. And whether they take particular measures to encourage innovation, support research and development by the private sector, participate in basic research themselves, or whether they work on education, skilling and reskilling on a very vast basis, will be obviously for them to decide. But we believe that productivity has to be encouraged and supported so that we can move not just from low mediocre to less low mediocre, which is how I would characterize our position now, to a not mediocre at all, with the prospect of a strong potential growth going forward. And that applies to all categories of economies that we are studying. As far as China is concerned, there is clearly good numbers coming out that are certainly as a result of some stimulus, some encouragement from the Chinese authorities. And we are also quite pleased to see the rebalancing that is taking place in China, from being heavily geared towards investment to being more geared towards consumption, from being a bit more into services, actually more into services, not a bit more into services, and less so in manufacturing. We are seeing, of course, the rebound of the export activity for obvious reasons, because demand addressed to China is picking up. So all of that is good and supportive. We also, as you know, have some very specific recommendations to China in relation to the credit growth in particular, and to the reining of the housing sector, which, despite efforts already undertaken, is continuing to grow.
Good. Reuters, gentleman with his hand up.
Hi, thanks, Madame Lagarde. At these meetings, of course, there is a lot of concern about the policies that the Trump administration is going to put in place. And so I'm just wondering sort of how you're viewing them, how you're reacting to them, particularly on the trade front. Do you view this as sort of a big noisy family where you really have to have a loud voice to get your view across, or is it a question of maybe adapting a bit because this is the new reality and we have to, and the organization has to change in its views to accommodate their views? Thanks.
You know, from the various contacts that I've had with the administration so far, I have every reason to believe that we will make progress, that we will cooperate all together in order to support and indeed improve the system as we have it. You know, the IMF is not the trade organization, but we are concerned about trade because it has been a major engine for growth, and it's actually one of the pillars of prosperity and growth going forward. So we certainly will be looking at how we can participate in that, how we can continue to support the growth of trade, and how it can be done in the most efficient, fair and global way as possible. And that implies clearly a level playing field, no use of distortive measures, and no protectionist measures going forward.
Thank you. I want to come to the lady in the front. Yes, ma'am.
Merci. Julienne, je suis.
Well, those are live proceedings from the US, and we've just seen IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde addressing the media on various issues like the inclusive growth. She says that their priority as the IMF is, of course, to maintain the growth momentum using what she calls fiscal monetary tools that will now be tailored to each country's policies as well as needs, making benefit systems more equitable and accessible to the people, minimum wages, that means raising them if they are too low, and also stepping up relocation as well as housing support for labor purposes. She also mentioned various things like your stronger cooperation with all member countries and the clamping down on tax avoidance, watching and revisiting those trade laws, and most importantly, as a group, effecting and realizing the Millennium Development Goals by ensuring that the countries have to now guard against their own self-inflicted wounds. And on China, she said that they have seen some great numbers, so they'll be looking at ways to support trade and grow it where they deem necessary. Let's take a quick ad break. More news.